Conservation Mismatch by Carleen Keene. Using Jenkins data, conservation mismatch addresses the issue that some of the least protected regions in the United States are home to some of the most vulnerable species. These are unprotected lands with little to no regulations of how to conserve the species and environment in these areas. Due to this, there is a high amount of species extinction since they are unprotected and their habitats are being used for other resources such as mining, logging, and tourism. Lands with biodiversity are also the most vulnerable and unprotected. Less than 8% of U.S. land is protected, leaving the rest to be altered by man. The U.S. government says to protect landscapes, not biodiversity, such that provides profit or tourism like the Grand Canyon. A landscape like this park is more likely to be preserved for its beauty and attraction rather than the wildlife that inhabits it. Along the coast and the southeast have the most biodiversity but are at the greatest harm for species extinction. Some species that are already extinct are some types of snails, mussels, and crayfish. Along with species loss is habitat loss, where homes of wildlife are being destroyed for non-renewable resources. This article addresses how effective conservation requires clear objectives and actions over places or species. The priority for future conservation investment discusses how actions are put first over species and places to consider economic, political, and social constraints on action, especially where areas of protection are most likely to be funded. Costs cannot be ignored, and these decisions account for the composition of species assemblages across sites of different species, not just hotspots. Cost and convenience need to be put above species at risk of extinction in this case. For this article, species and places are put at the focal point and highest devotion. The more protection, the better biodiversity comes of it. This needs to be handled on a local level so that biological priorities for conservation are handled instead of lost in the finances of higher level government. This GIS model considers 4 species, amphibians, birds, mammals, and trees, to then use a raster calculator to create biodiversity hotspots. The map shows in red high biodiversity versus blue with low biodiversity. The southeast part of the U.S. has the highest levels of biodiversity. As it goes to the rural west, biodiversity decreases. This GIS model uses protected public lands and uses the tools feature to point and point density to create a neighborhood protection map. The red areas are the most protected, which are scattered across the U.S., but are very minimal, showing the most in the west, where, from the previous slide, that is where the least biodiversity is. The blue areas on this map are the least protected, which covers most of the U.S. To conclude, hotspots for biodiversity have the least protection in the U.S. New regulations are necessary, especially since U.S. protected lands are minimal due to the controversy of profit versus conservation. There needs to be a shift in perspective if there will ever be a bounce back of species biodiversity.